Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the organizing team, I'm pleased to welcome you to the inaugural episode of the Eirenicon Africa Public Lecture Series. I want to thank all present. I look around and I see many familiar faces, and that's comforting. But I also see faces of people I don't know, not yet anyway, and I look forward to meeting everyone. I'm standing here representing an organizing team, and I'll ask them to stand up, please. I'll point them out, and I'll call their names. There's Ore right there. Chika next to her. Emmeline, 2 rows back. Eunice next to her. And Femi. Before explaining the purpose of this initiative, I'll explain the word Eirenicon. No, it's not the name of some company sponsoring this lecture series, and neither is it a word in the Nigerian language, as some have thought. Eirenicon, you can pronounce it any way you want. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it myself. It's a word derived from the Greek, and it's best defined as a proposition that harmonizes different viewpoints. And that's what we're seeking to do here. That's the reason for existence as a public lecture series. We seek to be a platform for discussing and debating the many meanings and contradictions of what it means to be an African today. We also intend to be a platform for the debate and the dissemination of ideas that will catalyze and direct the political, social, and economic development of our continent and the constituent countries within it. But more on that later. I'll keep my comments brief, as I'm not the keynote speaker you came to hear. That person is Mr. Mutiu Sumonu, who's Managing Director of Shell Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria. Joining him up here will be Rolake Akinkugbe, an oil and gas specialist, now with EcoBank Capital, and Tom Burgess of the Financial Times. We are honored to have Mr. Sumonu, but also privileged to have both Rolake and Tom. Rolake is very highly respected by all who know and have read her work or have listened to her play. As it happens, she's a classically trained jazz pianist. So also is Tom Burgess. Not a classically trained pianist, but very, very well respected by all that have read him. And Tom Burgess, he moved to Lagos in 2009 and to become the Financial Times West Africa correspondent, having previously covered Southern Africa from Johannesburg. He's now based in London, still with the FT, and all I will say about Tom's time in Lagos is that, believe me, there'll be 3 Nigerians on that stage. But we are here to listen to Mr. Sumonu. Rolake will say more about him, but I will be remiss if I did not mention that I have known him for a while, and I know him to be a person of great sincerity, decency, and integrity, and that he has been indefatigable in promoting indigenous Nigerian participation in the Nigerian oil and gas space. But this lecture is not just about Nigeria, and Mr. Sumonu's presentation, as chosen by him, will discuss Africa, not just Nigeria. I must also add that we owe him a great debt of gratitude. That he is here at all is due largely to the strength of his commitment to keeping his word. Business issues emerging last week threatened his appearance here, but his resolve to honor his commitment never wavered, and we are truly grateful. And I must also thank another man who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka. In his day job serves as the Bishop of Sokoto Diocese in Nigeria, but he moonlights as a public intellectual and a tormentor of dictators and the powerful. Many present today who know him, including Tom, I see Tom smiling, will attest that he's at once one of the most intelligent and funniest human beings you will ever meet. This lecture series was his idea, and we have simply carried out his vision. He was the mother. We are simply the midwives or the elves. Rolake will go over the format of the proceedings, which will end in a question and answer session. We request that all questions be asked with brevity and succinctness, and respectfully, with regard for our guests, including the man who traveled furthest to be here tonight. The question and answer session will end at 8:45 p.m. on the dot. Hopefully we'll stick to that more than we stuck to the starting time. And in time for closing remarks. And a drinks reception afterwards will feature live music, entertainment from Bimi Thomas and her band until 10:30 p.m. I have taken enough of your time, but one last thing that I'll ask, as tradition holds in many parts of Africa. At the beginning of a thing or birth of a person, we remember those who have passed on. I ask that we observe a moment of silence to commemorate those that have died as the countries of Africa seek to make themselves into entities deserving of the lives of the human beings that are their citizens. And of all those men, women, and children, I will ask your forbearance as I mention the name of one, Miss Yasmin El Rufai, who passed at the end of last year and was a member of the organizing team of the Eirenicon Africa Public Lecture Series. Thank you. Please, let's observe a moment's silence. Thank you. I now hand you over to the very capable hands of Rolake and Tom.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this public lecture series. I'm Rolake Akinwe, your chair. The format today is I'm just going to be giving a brief overview and introduction to the topic, after which Mr. Simone will talk for about 30 minutes and give us a presentation. After that, for about another 10 minutes, we're going to have Tom Burgess respond to some of the thoughts and ideas that Mr. Simone will express, after which we'll then open it to the floor. In 2008, I made my first trip to the Niger Delta. I flew over Brass Island, which is off Bayelsa State, one of the oil-producing states in the Niger Delta. And I could say that when I made that trip, I went there with a lot of excitement and indeed trepidation, because I'd heard a lot about what was going on there. And I was going to work on a project on the Brass LND project as a consultant for some of the investors in that project. And I remember speaking to some members of the community, the Tuan Brass community, the youth leaders. And the idea I had was that I was coming into this community that was highly impoverished. And I remember being ushered into this small hut, which was in the middle of the island, a highly impoverished island. And as soon as I stepped in, what I stepped into was a decked-out pad with plasma screen TVs, very well-polished environment, but sofa leather chairs. And in my mind, I thought, well, I'm in the middle of a place that's known for poverty and deprivation, but here were people who were claiming to act on behalf of the community, who were youth leaders in this community, and who lived what was indeed, I saw as quite an opulent life. And in a sense, that was a microcosm of what the oil industry had become to Africa, often seen as an enclave in the midst of bigger economies. Today, the world isn't running out of oil. We hear that the world is running out of cheap oil, the easy-to-refine oil. Africa itself supplies about 10% of the 89 million barrels of oil we consume every day. And as consumption and demand are increasing, we also know that we're going to need to find around 20 million new barrels of oil in about 5 years' time in order to continue to consume the 89 million barrels we consume today. So we're looking at declining reserves replacement ratios. We're looking at tighter supplies, and the importance of African oil has come to the fore, particularly with the Arab Spring we saw in 2011. And in all of this, we're seeing new frontier exploration interest in Africa. So today, I'm going to ask you to please focus your minds on those themes and Africa in the global context, in the context of the dispute between South Sudan and the North over oil exports and infrastructure, in the context of the problems we have in East Africa, and more recently with the subsidy gate scandals we've had in places like Niger and further afield, which I essentially think remind us that the free-willing business of oil refiners, oil speculators, is much more rooted in a political context that is hard to divorce from today. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Simonu to give his presentation. Thank you very much.
Let me just organize myself a little bit. Good evening, all. It's really indeed a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm also pleased that I'm having another session with Tom. I mean, Tom and I have gone a long way in Nigeria. He has always put me on the hot seat, asking me very difficult questions about Niger Delta, about oil. So I think today it will be a different role you'll be playing. We should both be answering questions from the audience rather than you asking me a question. I think it's important for me to just give you a very short bio of myself. As my name will suggest, I'm a full-blooded Nigerian. And I've lived in the Niger Delta for very many years. I have also worked for Shell Nigeria for many years. I'm sure for many years, more than the ages of many of you around the room here. And I always say that I'm a very loyal employee. I've never known any other employer in my life. And I think there is no opportunity anymore for me to flirt with any other employer. I think it's too late now. I know many of you have probably changed jobs, half a dozen times, but that was not the case with me. I've also worked for like 33 years in the oil and gas industry. So the industry is about the only industry I know. And that's why when I was asked to pick a topic, I felt the topic that you have today is probably going to be the most appropriate one, where I can at least show my knowledge and my understanding of that industry. But I will not be talking specifically about Nigeria. I will be talking about Africa, as a whole. And before I delve into the oil and gas issue, I would just like to give you some general context of the economic growth of Africa. I think it's also important for us to appreciate that the middle class in Africa is becoming a force to reckon with. We are seeing young men and women of African origin showing unprecedented entrepreneurial attitude and behavior. And they are showing their assertiveness in all spheres of life. As a Nigerian, as an African, I'm really pleased with what I see as the emerging middle class in Africa. The Africa Development Bank did say that the African middle class rose to 313 million people in 2010, compared to 196 million in 2000. That almost doubled what we had in 2010. Let's take a look at African growth. A 2011 report by the Economics magazine shows that 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world between 2000 and 2010 were African. In 2000, the same publication ran a cover story titled "The Hopeless Continent." Today, that hopeless continent has become a hopeful continent. How the tide has changed. Look at Nigeria, for instance, where GDP was over 7% in the third quarter of 2011, according to Trading Economics. Historically, from 2005 until 2010, Nigeria's average quarterly GDP was 6.7%, reaching a historic high of 8.29% in December of 2010. Angola has done very well too. With large deposits of oil and diamonds, as well as natural gas reserves, Angola is among Africa's most resource-rich countries. The country expects to increase oil output to 1.84 million barrels per day in 2012. This will help the economy expand by 12.8%, according to the news report. In 1975, when I was still a student at the University of Lagos, I'm sure many people in this room were not born yet, Africa had half the population of Europe. That was 37 years ago. In 2004, Africa overtook Europe. And by 2050, the projected population is going to be under 2 billion, compared to 720 million Europeans. You can see the huge gap that we are talking about. And all these people will need food, water, and energy. Not too long ago, the Earth's 7th billionth person was born. And experts tell us there will be 9 billion or more of us by the year 2050. About half of that projected growth in population in 2050 will be in sub-Saharan Africa. Many parts of Africa are currently experiencing energy poverty. According to the World Bank, nearly 600 million people in Africa lack access to electricity. And many of the remaining 300 to 400 million Africans who are nominally serviced by the grid suffer low-quality supply and frequent power cuts. Energy demand growth in Africa is expected to outstrip that of the more developed areas, yet the continent is a net exporter of energy. I mean, if you just look at this graph again and you just ponder on it, you could see that the growth in Africa is phenomenal. It's extremely impressive. But let's be clear that this growth does not, in all cases, translate to development. It does not, in all cases, translate to quality of life. It has not actually put wealth in the hands of many Africans. So it is important for us to therefore start to think about how all this growth can actually make meanings to people who live in Africa, to people of African descent. I want to talk a little bit about oil discoveries in Africa. Africa has substantial reserves of oil and gas. About 10% and 8% of the world's proved reserve, respectively, and consumes substantially less than half of that annually. In addition, there is coal, and the biofuel potential in many African countries, such as Nigeria and Kenya, is huge. As an energy exporter, Africa has some comparative advantages. It is strategically located between major centers of demand in Asia, Europe, and North America. Production costs are reasonable, and Africa's oil and gas is of good quality. The area is also relatively underexplored, so we expect oil and gas reserve numbers to increase in the years ahead. For example, McKinsey reports that an estimated 3.5 billion barrels of oil equivalent of reserves were discovered in the region in 2010. Most of the new reserves were in deep water, and about 60% was gas. Nearly half of the reserves were discovered in the deep water Rovumba Basin offshore in Mozambique. East Africa is now emerging as a world-class oil and gas province. The continued high levels of interest in the Gulf of Guinea, from Angola to Ghana, ensure that this area will also remain a key growth region for the entire industry. Africa is well placed to remain a major energy exporter for many years, and we will also see substantial expansion of the domestic market. According to OPEC, some modest growth in 2012 is expected in Ghana, Uganda, Niger, and Equatorial Guinea, but this will be offset by possible declines in Sudan, Egypt, and other countries. If Africa is so blessed, what then are the pitfalls in the oil and gas industry? And that takes me to the crux of my address today. The first thing I would like to talk about in terms of the pitfalls is corruption. Oil revenues have been subjected to various abuses by government officials in several African countries. In his book, The Political Economy of Oil and Gas in Africa, Swalak Ariwe-Rukuma tells us that a panel report on the reform of the central bank in Nigeria showed that more than $12 billion of oil revenue accrued to the country between 1988 and 1994 were not properly accounted for. The story is not different in Angola. According to Revenue Watch, the financial relations between the government and the national oil company were complex and secretive. as are the subcontracting procedures for assigning oil sector work to outside companies, which are frequently closely linked to powerful politicians. And it was in the news not too long ago that corruption is rampant in Liberia's oil sector, even before any oil has been discovered. That, for me, is going to be a major pitfall that all Africans, well-meaning nations must join hands to correct. Because the amount of resources available to Africa is likely to grow. And I really want to enjoin everyone here to start to think about the future generation. This wealth must be used to make sure that the future generation have the best quality of life, that the resources that God has put at their possession to develop. The other pitfall I want to talk about is government's overdependency on the oil and gas industry. In Nigeria, for instance, the country depends on the oil and gas industry for about 95% of its export earnings and 80% of government revenue. In Angola, oil is the overwhelmingly dominant force in the economy, representing about 58% of the Angola's GDP and 80% of government revenue. Apart from oil and gas, Africa has other huge natural resources: lead, granite, limestone, salt, and agriculture. In the 60s, agricultural products such as palm oil and cocoa made up a significant portion of Nigeria's exports. Today, they barely register as trade items. Lack of stability in Africa is another major pitfall. Most times, major oil and gas projects take a decade or more from exploration to first production. Billions of dollars may be committed against returns, which may take years of production to recover. In fiscal terms, political stability and sanctity of contract cannot be relied on. Companies will hesitate to invest, choosing instead to put their money into regions where the climate is more reliable. I think the other thing I want to mention with respect to stability is also African governments taking long-term view about the country. The oil and gas industry is not a short-term business. It takes an average, especially in deep water, 7 to 10 years for you to start and implement a project. Most African country leaders just don't have that patience. They are looking for quick wins. They want to invest within their 4-year or 5-year tenure and start to see the result. They don't want to invest for the next successive government. That is a major pitfall in the oil and gas industry in Africa, and it's got to be addressed. We have to start to understand that the oil and gas industry requires long-term planning, long-term perspective, and long-staying power. Unrest is a key issue. Last year was a period of revolutions in North Africa, more popularly called the Arab Spring. We saw uprisings in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, which severely affected oil and gas production in the continent. In Libya, for instance, production had dropped to less than 20,000 barrels per day in August, from a pre-conflict level of 1.6 million barrels per day, according to Wood Mackenzie. In Nigeria, until recently, unrest grew in the Niger Delta and communities targeted operations of energy companies. They demanded better public services and a greater share of government revenue. We saw heavily armed and well-organized groups attack oil and gas facilities in the Delta. They shut down operations, kidnapped staff, and sabotaged oil pipelines. The effects were devastating economically, socially, and environmentally. But I have always believed in using peaceful means to resolve issues with host communities. And that's why I'm pleased that the federal government's amnesty program for militants in the Niger Delta has been a success so far. So what are the opportunities in Africa oil and gas sector? A competitive oil and gas sector can drive huge growth and employment in Africa for many years to come. The industries support thousands of jobs, a very high proportion of which are well paid and highly skilled. Revenues from oil and gas can be used for infrastructural development. For instance, in the 70s, with income from the surging oil price, the federal government of Nigeria set out to develop infrastructure and lay the foundations for an industry base. I mentioned earlier that millions of Africans do not have access to power. African businesses need reasonably priced, reliable power to allow them to compete in the global marketplace and thus provide much needed employment. As well as employment, Africans, like everybody else, want to improve their lives. They want modern comforts, power for registration, clean burning gas to cook with, and fuel for their cars. The World Bank estimates that since 1995, Africa's power sector has grown an average of only 1% annually, whilst growth of more than 10% a year is required to meet demand. If we take a look at Nigeria, our total generating capacity today is about 3,500. We are targeting 4,000. If you take a look at South Africa, they have a generating capacity of about 40,000. And compare their population with that of Nigeria. Certainly, oil and gas companies can play an important part in power supply. Let's take a look at the electricity challenge. This is just showing you the electricity challenge in Nigeria. The roadmap for power in Nigeria has an aspiration to increase power generation to 40,000 megawatts by the year 2020. So that's 8 years from now. That is where South Africa is today, with about a third of Nigeria's population. According to the roadmap, the country will need to invest about $10 billion per annum to achieve these 40,000 megawatts by the year 2020. $10 billion per annum is a whopping sum. Where will that come from? Do we have the enabling environment to attract such a huge foreign direct investment? And this is just Nigeria. So you can then extrapolate to see what will be required for the rest of Africa. This is certainly an enormous investment opportunity along the gas to power value chain. So if there are some of you in this room who are looking for how to invest your pounds and your dollars, you can't go wrong with power. So that's a very good investment opportunity for you. And I will surely recommend it. Simply providing the power is challenging enough. Increasingly, policymakers and consumers around the world are concerned about the source of their energy and the impact it has on the environment. Because everywhere you go, people talk about the environment now. So what is going to be the source for power? Are you still going to be emphasizing coal? It's going to be a big question for the future. In my opinion, fossil fuels will continue to provide much of Africans' energy needs. Such fuels will still provide some 60% of global demand. But even then, significant choices will have to be made in order to minimize the impact on the environment. I think when we talk about environmental issue, you cannot discuss that without talking about gas. Gas is generally the most affordable, the most environmentally acceptable, and in many cases, readily available. According to the IEA, worldwide gas resources are now estimated at equal to 250 years of current production. All major regions, including Africa, have recoverable resources equal to at least 75 years of production at current consumption rates. According to the 2011 statistical review, Algeria holds over 159 TCF of gas, Egypt about 78 TCF, and Nigeria over 186 CTF. To put it in perspective, the US has about 40 TCF, and Nigeria has about 180 TCF, several order of magnitude. Ironically, in Nigeria's case, almost all of this is gas that is being discovered while exploring for oil. So we have really not started looking for gas in Nigeria. So what that tells us is that there is potential for much more gas in Nigeria. And I guess it's going to be the same for the rest of Africa. One of the historical challenges to fully harnessing the potential of gas has been the cost of transportation from often remote gas fields to centers of consumption. But the liquefied natural gas business has changed all of that. I never fail to do a little bit of a marketing pitch whenever I have an opportunity to talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about LNG and what Shell is doing in that market. The growth in demand for LNG is stimulating a remarkable expansion in supplies, which Shell expect to grow at 6% per annum throughout the decade. We are also seeing industries starting to produce and liquefy natural gas at sea, opening up large deposits which may otherwise remain stranded. I think there is an unprecedented game changer in technology, which is making it possible for us to be able to liquefy gas at sea. In the past, you always have to do it you have to create a port, more or less, for it. But now we can do it, at sea. And that in itself is going to open up a lot of supply options for the LNG business. Royal Dutch Shell has announced the final investment decision to build a floating LNG facility that will develop a Prelude gas field offshore Australia. At 488 meters long, this will be the largest offshore facility in the world. Prelude will be the first in many such floating facilities. Deep water gas discoveries, such as Rovumba Basin offshore that has been announced in East Africa, are a great opportunity for further deployment of such technology. Africa is no doubt a continent of opportunities. As an example, the telecoms firms have signed up more than 316 million new mobile phone subscribers on the continent since 2000, more than the total UK population, according to McKinsey. And as Africa's economy grows, the oil and gas industry will provide the modern energy that Africans need and increasingly demand. So investors must unlock the value of Africa's oil and gas resources to help maintain the continent's growth. In my view, whilst it is true that the story of oil in Africa is replete with many examples of negativity. We've talked about corruption, we've talked about overdependence. There are immense opportunities ahead for Africa. Clearly, Africa has hope. We have more than hope. We have resources. We have the talent. All we need to do is to harness these resources for future generations. I believe and I know that there are better days ahead for Africa. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simonu, for taking us on that whirlwind tour of Africa, oil and gas. I'm now going to ask Tom Burgess of the FT to respond. Tom has had a lot of experience on the ground, and I guess he brings a non-African perspective to his experiences of oil and gas in Africa. Tom, please.
Thanks, and thanks, Mutu, very much for that. That was fascinating. What I'd like to do, what we discussed earlier, is if I could, I think there are three things I'd like to pick up on, and each is a short point, and then that leads to a question for you, because I imagine people want to listen to you rather than me. In general, I think what I'm trying to get at here is you were looking at avoiding the pitfalls, harnessing the opportunities. I think one of the questions whenever we look at Africa in the context of the global energy industry or broader resource industry is why why have so many resource-rich African countries, as others in Central Asia or South America, why in this case have so many African resource-rich countries failed to benefit, and indeed suffered as a consequence, as a sort of paradoxical consequence of that wealth? And I think I would like to try and put you in the hot seat again slightly, Mukti, because I think what we didn't hear there was much examination of the role of the industry itself in that. So if I can pick you up on your point about the environmental impact, the links to gas, I think is important. Gas, I would completely agree with you. Nigeria has been a potential gas giant for far too long, and Shell has done a lot to increase production in gas, I think significantly more than any of the other IOCs. And gas is different to crude. It has a far greater developmental impact. There's a much greater scope for harnessing Nigeria's gas for the benefit of Nigerians, the majority, than for a few as benefit from crude. But if we look at the environmental situation in the Delta at the moment, we can talk and talk and talk about the potential for gas and the potential for more electricity, but at the moment, as we all know, the Niger Delta's environment has been grotesquely damaged by 50-odd years of 50, 60-odd years of oil extraction. We still have flaring. I know Shell has reduced flaring, others have too, but gas flaring is still widespread. So my question is this: isn't the reason that you see environmental damage on the scale that you see in the Delta, and which is just taken almost as a given compared to, say, the outrage that followed the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, isn't the reason for that the international oil companies operating in onshore Nigeria, as in onshore places elsewhere in West Africa, apply lower environmental standards than they do and than they are held to when they're operating in G8 countries or North American and European countries? Isn't there almost a hypocrisy there?
Does that mean that's a good question? Well, I think I've always known that there's no way I will come to an audience like this and I will not be challenged about the standards of international oil companies in the Delta. There's no way I will not be challenged about flaring, about environmental devastation. Let me say first and foremost that as a Nigerian, the situation in the Delta actually brings tears to my eyes. I see it, I feel it. But I want to assure you that the issue is not about double standards by the oil companies. The issue is about protest, it's about poverty, it's about lawlessness in the Delta. People in the Delta are completely unhappy because they are not seeing the benefit of the wealth that is behind their backyard. And therefore, they are taking the laws into their hands. They are stealing the crude to make money for themselves. And in stealing the crude, they are polluting the environment on a very, very large scale. Some 2 months ago, I've had to shut down a field producing about 25,000 barrels a day. This afternoon, I was in a long teleconference with my operations managers in Nigeria, where I was contemplating shutting down another 140,000 barrels of oil per day, because when I overflew that region, I saw a lot of illegal refineries taking place there. I saw heavy machineries. I saw crude oil thieves working completely undisturbed. And you look at the situation, then you ask yourself, this is really not tenable. But rather than just continue to talk about criminality, I always also want to ask myself, what is behind all of this? Whilst criminality should not be condoned, but it's also clear that poverty is really behind it. The people in the Delta, they don't have access to clean water. They don't have access to good medical care. They don't have access to education. There are no jobs. So everyone is trying to fend for himself. And they have seen this oil as an easy source to make money. So when you see pollution in the Delta, it's not the oil company causing it. I don't have any business, putting my oil outside of the pipeline. I want my oil in the pipeline so that I can monetize it. So it's counterintuitive for the oil companies to continue to promote spill. So I think it's important for the audience to be aware of that. It's not about double standard. It's just about the situation in the Delta, a lot of lawlessness, and you need federal government and state government support to actually stamp out those activities.
That's an interesting point. Tom, I guess what I'm hearing here from the question is there seems to be oil companies operating in a vacuum. Is your question sort of premised on the fact that you're expecting oil companies to play the role of government? Because I've seen situations in the Delta where, again, referring to Brass Island, where a particular oil company was actually providing the electricity in the local area, where whilst the local government chairman was actually in the Port Harcourt metropolis, and he wasn't actually on the ground within the communities. So I think what I'm hearing here is an absence of governance, a vacuum, essentially, in which oil companies. Is that your experience based on the ground?
Sometimes, in some situations. What I'm driving at here is more that the recent documentation of the environmental situation in the Delta, thinking of the UN Environment Programme report, did find responsibility on the part of Shell and the other oil companies. I take your point that there's an absence of governance, and that the oil companies do, in some limited areas, fill that role. But my point is that with that comes almost a greater responsibility, and that perhaps sometimes, in some cases, some oil companies are therefore able to act with impunity. Because if what we're saying is there's an absence of governance, then there's an absence of regulation. Yeah. This isn't my position. I'm drawing on the UN report, and it does strike me from that report and from earlier research that the oil companies are operating, admittedly in a very difficult climate, but to a lower standard than they would be able to in, say, Alaska.
Well, I think on the UN report, let me just make one piece of clarification. The UN report is not about the entire Niger Delta. The UN report is about Ogoni. Ogoni is not representative of the Niger Delta. That's number one clarification I want to make. Shell has pulled out of Ogoni since 1993. So there has not been any oil and gas exploration or production activities in Ogoni since 1993 when we pulled out. That in itself gave easy access to existing facilities in Ogoni to hoodlums and criminals. And you see, if you go to Ogoni today, you will see large-scale crude oil theft taking place. You will see hundreds of local refineries in Ogoni. That was the cause of the devastation in Ogoni. The third clarification I want to make is that the UN report did not apportion blame. The terms of reference for the UN report was to go into Ogoni and identify all areas where there is pollution. And if you look at that report carefully, it did say that any attempt to clean up Ogoni will be an exercise in futility if government does not move in to stop all the illegal activities happening in Ogoni. So I just thought I need to put that in perspective. But having said that, I personally see the UN report as an opportunity for a change. in Ogoni and in the Delta. And that's why I welcome that report wholeheartedly, and Shell Company also welcomes that report, because we believe we can use it as an opportunity to get government to do what they need to do to bring stability into the area, and such that oil and gas operation can exist in an environment devoid of crime.
Can I just come back on the hoodlums and the criminals? Some of whom are friends of mine. And I know we're staying very local to the Delta, but you know it doesn't get bigger in African oil and gas than the Delta. So there we are, onshore anyway. And I think it has lessons for maybe we'll come to later the new producing countries. I think often the conflict in the Delta is seen, especially sometimes from London or from abroad, in too simplistic terms, and you have the idea of oil companies and sort of freedom fighters slugging it out for control of natural resources, which is sort of so simplistic as to be just a cartoon. I mean, and you touched on with your slide with the lads with their AK-47s. That narrative is kind of I think attractive to some people, but it's not true. It's a much more complex relationship. Yes, absolutely, there are hoodlums and criminals, as there are in Regent's Park, but there's a very complicated relationship I found in weeks and weeks and weeks spent in the Delta, in the creeks of the cities, between, yes, criminal gangs, political gangs, cults based out of the universities, groups loosely affiliated into the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, parts of the armed forces. Now, my question here is, a lot of those young men, almost exclusively young men, who accepted the amnesty, I spent a lot of time talking to them, and I spent a lot of time talking to people who are senior figures in men in the umbrella group, and they describe a situation where the oil companies have a much more complex relationship with these groups than is sometimes portrayed. And at low levels of the oil companies, it seemed, there's a relationship of using informal security contracts, of trying to negotiate with these guys to protect parts of your pipeline, certain onshore fields, certain transit routes. And there's a very strong, very clear, on the record suggestion from a lot of these guys that they benefited from these informal financial security contracts. They benefited from social projects that were targeted towards militant areas. So my question is really, do you think that the oil companies have paradoxically played a role in sustaining the conflict, even if some of it is well-intentioned, by trying to manage this situation, by trying to manage this conflict, and introducing more funding into it, introducing more rivalries into it?
No, it's a very difficult question, and I believe that some of the things we do in the Delta could indeed unintentionally provoke conflict. And I would be the first to admit that the dynamics in the Delta is a very complex one. In one vein, the oil company might be thinking of promoting development within a community. But you may not realize that that community is not a homogeneous one. So you are looking at it as a single community, well united. It's only when you go in there that you will find out that there are factions within the community. And so your effort at promoting development could, in some cases, actually lead to conflict. And I think the point you are talking about, the oil companies using some of the militants as surveillance guard, I can tell you that as far as Shell is concerned, our business principle is very clear. We do not pay protection money. However, you also have to admit that except a guy has a label on his forehead saying I'm a militant, you do not know who is a militant and who is a genuine contractor. So there could be cases in the past where you have thought you are employing, a genuine bona fide contractor, and yet he's probably a militant or a warlord. So I will not argue that such situations, could have arisen in the past, but it's always with the best of intentions. And yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say perhaps sort of to pick on one of the really interesting points you made in your presentation, and Tom, perhaps you might have something to say about this. It was when you talked about the opportunities, I picked up that you said $10 billion was about the size of the money that would needed to be spent on developing Nigeria's power sector. And one of the things that struck me about that was 10 billion was also the amount of money that the Nigerian government was meant to have spent on subsidy payments for petroleum products in the country in 2011. And it strikes me that a lot of governments in Africa always playing catch-up. You mentioned the gas resources as well. We're already playing catch-up in the sense that, North America and Canada are moving towards shale gas development, and that could affect demand from gas from Africa. Mm-hmm. You also talked about the fact that political instability was a problem, and perhaps the style of African governments is not conducive to all sector management. Again, all of these strikes me, whereas other parts of the world have moved on in terms of strategic and national planning, African governments are still playing catch-up in many ways, and natural resources seem to continually be a sticking point. I was wondering whether perhaps you had comments on that.
Well, I think I very much agree with you. Again, the greatest challenge Africa has is governance. And every African has a strong role to play there, frankly speaking. I look at my generation, I just take a look back in history and see what government has been like, in the last 40, 50 years. Certainly there must be a change if Africa is going to actually come into the league of developed nations and stop playing catch-up, as you said. So my first proposition is that we need, as Africans, we really need to start to think of how can we promote good governance in our various environments, at the local government, at the state government, and at the federal level. That, for me, is going to be the crux of the matter, good governance, nothing more. Once you can have good governance, all other things will fall in place. Infrastructure will come, there will be good planning of the economy, there will be all the infrastructural related issues that are holding Africa back can be solved. But without good governance, you have no chance in hell in solving this problem.
Tom, I'd like you to be a bit frank, because I think we need to push you as well a bit. You've been working in Nigeria on the ground. What would you say, in your view, was the biggest single obstacle in the oil industry? And in terms of governance on the ground, what would you say was the key sticking point, based on your observation as a foreigner living in Africa, in Nigeria?
The biggest obstacle to what, sorry?
Biggest obstacle to progress in the industry, what you saw as a major problem. We've talked about governance, we've talked about corruption.
Yeah, but progress of Nigeria? Or
the progress of the country
yeah.
as an oil-producing country.
Yeah. What's, in my view, stopping Nigeria progressing as a country is that it is an oil-producing country. I mean, that is central to... doesn't have to be like that, but as Mutu said, the dependency on oil, we can talk about it, we can look at the numbers, 95% of hard currency is earned through the oil industry, 80% of government revenues and all the rest of it. And we hear this and we think, well, that's a lot, but what does this really mean? It means that in Nigeria, it's apparent in Angola, Equatorial Guinea, in the extractive industries, countries that aren't dependent on oil but are dependent on other things, Guinea, Conakry, DRC. You see it in all these countries. When you have heavy dependence for government revenue on a single commodity revenue stream, and forgive me if everybody already knows this, but clearly what develops is a small and unaccountable government, which is accountable to those extractive companies far more than it is to its own people. In Western Europe, in other parts of Africa, in parts of South America, North America, parts of Asia, the bargain is simple, isn't it? The government funds itself by raising income tax. There's a bond there. We fund the government. We can withdraw that consent. There is no consent in a country like Nigeria, really, to the way government works because of the structure of the economy. Now, the way, obviously, to break that is to diversify. So you come to gas, you come to improve governance, you come to electricity, broadening out the economy. But the problem is you're in a catch-22. How do you get a government which is not beholden to the people to act in their interests?
I'd just like you to hold that thought. I'm quite conscious that we haven't involved you guys. So perhaps what I'm going to do now is going to take questions in batches of 3. And if you do have any comments, make them quite short. We would prefer questions. So who wants to have a go first? The lady over there.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Alice Ukoko, and I come from a place called Uziri Land in the Niger Delta, in Delta State. I'm aware that there is so much problem, and I'm sure that your honorable self is also aware that the community is agitating for an MOU to be signed with Shell after 56 years of operating in a way without the consent of the community. This has cost us 3 youths through your usual JTF that kills people, if you ask. So could you tell us, please, whether Shell will be willing to do an MOU with the communities and then take some responsibility in the absence of an effective governance in the Niger Delta to ease the burden of the environmental destruction, the impoverishment, and the constant killing of our people? Would you do that? Or would you be willing to move the people, human lives, from the Niger Delta to a different place so you can have a free place where you can do the oil exploration and the gas with those people in the Nigerian government who are actually benefiting from the oil to the detriment and the killing of the people? Thank you.
Thank you. You've mentioned that the wealth doesn't often get to the majority of ordinary people. And one of the best ways of starting to change that... Can you say who
you are, actually? Sorry, please.
Sorry, my name's James Fisher, and I'm from the One campaign. One of the best ways of changing that situation is to make the payments that companies pay governments transparent. So can I ask why your company is lobbying against proposed European legislation which would do that and give citizens an opportunity to try and start holding their governments to account?
Okay, one more question. And just bearing in mind that this is more about Africa, not just Nigeria. So can I take the gentleman here in front?
Peter Sharp of the Commonwealth Business Council. Traveling around the world doing international projects for 30-something years, one thing I've started to realize that human beings in certain situations always behave in a certain way, in a certain predictable way. So therefore, when you have a country like Nigeria with intractable problems, it's usually in response to, shall we say, something that is wrong in the system. So, as I say, people will respond in a certain way if something is wrong. What is wrong in Nigeria? Well, you look at a country like Ghana, quite next door. It doesn't have a lot of the disruptive problems of Nigeria. Okay, it hasn't had the explosion of oil, but oil isn't the only thing. Many countries around the world manage oil wealth very well, okay? And Shell are even there, I believe, in some of those countries. So that isn't really the problem. What is the problem? What's the difference between Ghana and Nigeria? In my opinion, it's one thing, and this is the root of the problem. In Ghana, education is compulsory. In Nigeria, it isn't. So the vast majority of people in Nigeria are uneducated. They don't know how to handle wealth. They don't know how to handle jobs or create jobs. They are behaving like animals in many cases without education.
Can I just crave indulgence of the audience and just let him finish his point and then we can
They haven't had the education that turns a living organism into a full civilized human being because of the lack of education, as they have in Ghana.
And your question is?
As they have in Ghana. So, please, look,
can we
if you don't
please exercise some decorum?
How the hell are you going to solve it? I've been in Nigeria for 30-something years, and it's been getting worse and worse.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman.
Thank you. So please, I'm just saying, what is the Speaker's opinion of the consideration of education, the educational system in Nigeria being at the root?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Just on that last question, I'm actually going to ask Tom Burgess perhaps to respond to Peter Chapman's question. And maybe Mr. Simonu, you can take the ones from Mrs. Okoko and James Fisher.
Okay. By and large, I disagree. Where on the one point that I would agree is that is that there are huge problems in the Nigerian education system, and particularly the decline of what were once world-class universities is a great loss. I don't think anyone would disagree with that.
You see, the problem is Nigeria, education is not compulsory. So the vast majority...
Can we just allow him to respond, please?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Right, yeah, I mean, I don't really claim to be an expert on the Nigerian system. What I would say more broadly is that I just... In my experience, Nigeria is full of... I mean, without getting into a potential minefield, particularly the southwest is full of extraordinarily well-educated, intelligent people doing extraordinary things. I think there's a problem with a crumbling education system in the north, but that's in parts of the north, but that's a different question. I think there are others better placed to respond. But what I would just say is, everyone's always very keen to say how great Ghana is and how dreadful Nigeria is, and. Okay, there's a reason why people prefer to hang out in Accra rather than Lagos. It takes a certain kind of maniac, for want of a better word, to want to set up in Lagos. But I would just challenge this notion that Ghana is some sort of paradigm for African resource countries to follow. Yet, yes, it's been more peaceful. That we can get into all sorts of reasons for that. But levels of economic development in Ghana are not that different to Nigeria. The World Bank itself, Ghana is always held up as this model for how to manage your resources. The World Bank itself in 2003, having foisted an awful lot of enormous gold mines on Ghana, concluded in its internal report on its history of projects that it couldn't work out whether gold had brought any benefit to Ghana on a broad economic level. These are the same people who are advising on the introduction of the oil industry. I won't go on, but I just think that there's sometimes a missed comparison.
And I'll let members of the audience come back to that particular point that was raised by Mr. Chapman. Mr. Simonu, just on the questions from the One Campaign chap and Mrs. Okoko.
Yeah. I think, let me say, Alice, that I personally regret the breakout of hostility in Uzere. Because I've been following that particular incident very, very closely. Even yesterday, before I traveled here, I had to go to Asaba to go and have an audience with the governor to lean on him to intervene with a view to helping to resolve the communal strife in Uzere in a manner that everyone will be satisfied with. I've also met with other leaders of Uzere community just in the search for peace. I don't want to go into the whole issue of whether we have an MOU or not, to be honest, because I really don't think that will not be of interest to this audience. But I can assure you that we are committed to working with the state government, with the elders of that community, to see how we can resolve the issues in Uzere amicably. But I must add that in any community, Shell is not in a position to take up the role of government. our communities are really burdened, and I know that. You know, there's a lot of poverty, and it's not just in the Niger Delta alone, it's all over the country. And what is important for people to understand is that 95% of the revenue that Shell makes, 95% of that goes back to government as royalty and taxes. So I always make the point that even if I pour in all the money I make in Shell into community development, it's going to be a drop in the ocean. As a company, even at today's oil price, I make less than $2 on a barrel. The balance goes back to government. So I think it's important for us to understand who has the financial muscle to make a difference in the community. But we will not say because we pay our taxes, we pay royalties, we will not do anything for the community. We are always in dialogue with organizations, with development agencies, to see how best we can support the growth of the communities. We have done a lot in the past, but I believe, honestly, that we can still do more, and that we should do more. And we continue to look for those opportunities to make sure that whatever we do can be more impactful in the community. James, you did talk about making payment to government transparent. Again, let me assure you that Shell is at the vanguard of transparency. We actually were the strongest advocate. We were the chairman of NEIT, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. And we supported the government in publishing how much oil revenue goes to government, how much of that revenue also is plowed back, to the state. And the figures are there, which I think is a step in the right direction. And I'm sure that by the end of this year, by the time, or even before the end of the year, when the European Union comes up with a clear legislation on oil revenue transparency, we will be the first, I can assure you, to actually implement that. We are very supportive of it because it makes our life a lot easier.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
Just really quickly to follow up on that. Mutu, if you're in the vanguard of transparency, you could, from tomorrow, start publishing country by country income and expenditure broken down, as in some jurisdictions you're obliged to do. That would make an enormous difference in Nigeria if we had those oil company numbers.
Yeah, but first of all, let me explain my relationship with the government of Nigeria. So when you hear Shell, Shell is in a joint venture with other oil companies and the government of Nigeria. I'm only a 30% shareholder in that joint venture. Government has 55%, Total has 10%, and Ajib has 5%. So I just don't have that ability for unilateral action as people think. A lot of people don't realize that I'm more or less just a contractor to the government of Nigeria. So I cannot, and that's why I cannot just go and start to publish, how much I pay the Nigerian government on my own. It's got to be something that you advocate for, you lobby them for, you make them see that it is good for governance, it is good for transparency. And that is what we are doing, trying to convince them that it's also made the job of governance a lot easier. So we are supportive of the European Union legislation that is likely to come out, and we lobby the federal government of Nigeria to also support it. But I can't do what you are asking me to do unilaterally. All
right. Can we take another group of questions, please? Can I ask you to keep your questions very short and succinct so we can get as many people in? Can I take the gentleman over there? Can you speak a bit louder, please? Thank you.
Transparency in payment. It is not the role of any company to make sure that the government collects their tax. transparently. You know, in 2010, I was traveling around East Africa for 5 months. I went to one country. I'm not going to mention the name, but the country gives some companies, international companies that are interested in their country, ultimatum to construct roads before they can give them allocation to do business in their country. Now, there is a problem because it is not the role of any company to construct roads. It is not the role of Shell to address the social ills in Nigeria, just like it's not the role of Financial Times to address the social ills in the United Kingdom. The role of every private enterprise is clear, and the role of every government is clear. But the problem is that there is confusion in the way things are communicated to the people. Just like, you know, all the questions being addressed to Mr. Simoni by Tom, they are the questions that should be addressed to Nigerian government. You know, I work in private sector. There are key objectives that every organization aims to achieve. It is not to, you know, solve crime. Obviously, they have to try to solve crime, but that is not the objective.
I'm going to have to stop you there,
okay,
please.
so finally, the question is that, is it not the case that the way things are communicated is wrong?
All right, thank you very much. Next question, please. Can I take the gentleman right in the back, please? The white guy.
Hi, right. Okay. Right, my name is Gregory Cronston. I work for FBN, First Bank of Nigeria. So one comment and one question. The comment is, look, there's a lot of talk about this 95% actually, but people overlook remittances.
95%, sorry.
Well, everyone say 95% oil, 95% of merchandise exports, right? So, but if you're talking about the foreign exchange flows, you have to include remittances, right? And remittances are, you know, in a bad year of oil price, remittances make up about 40% of oil, right? So that's a source of wealth creation, separate to oil. But the question is, very simple question, this petroleum industry bill, we all know about it. It's been 3 years in the Assembly. And in one version of it, there was a suggestion that a percentage of revenues from each joint venture, I think, would accrue to local communities. So my question for the Speaker is, if this actually has come to pass, what would you recommend as a way to operate this so that it would be effective, and obviously the money would end up in the communities?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ayo in the back over there.
Thank you. My name is Ayo Johnson. Excuse me, sir. You've mentioned that you understand the issues on the Niger Delta. You've mentioned that you see it, you feel it. The next question is, what are you doing about it? And if you are doing something about it, then the question is, why is it that no one seems to understand what it is you're doing? And would you accept and acknowledge that you may have an image problem? And if you do, then the question is, what are you going to do using the muscle that you have through your social corporate responsibility and clearly the leverage that you have with the Nigerian government to address the image problem which you have in Nigeria and also that seems to be having a problem elsewhere in the world?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to slip in one more question. There's a lady in front here.
Hi, my name's Cami Alexander from K-Time Consulting, Management and International Marketing Consultants. You asked that we broaden out the discussion, and basically the work I do involves consulting for companies like Shell in the UK and also international marketing events like the African Petroleum Energy Forum with the Chinese government. We take energy ministers from around the world, you know, from Africa to meet their counterparts from around the world. Now, I spoke at a conference in July last year in Liberia, so I think I'll refer to that. They referred to the potential discovery of oil as it has been a resource curse in other African countries. Now, Liberia has a very unusual population construct in that over 50% are the youth, and with its recent history, there's a lot of unrest. So what advice would you give the management of the national oil company over there in terms of, the forum was called Increasing Equity Participation for the shareholders, the stakeholders, apart from the large oil companies for the average man in the street, or I should say youth nowadays. But how would you, what advice would you give them to avoid a potential Niger Delta situation? Because you've mentioned that it takes a very long-term strategic planning in order for it to go from potential discovery to seeing the results on the streets. And the other, on the harnessing the opportunities, you've mentioned that, I mean, I used Shell as an example, as a case study when I was talking at the conference. But what are the opportunities that are coming through in terms of jobs? Are these the type of jobs that the youth should be aspiring to? I mean, I noticed that a lot of the oil companies bring, they bring the expertise from overseas. How can we make sure that the jobs are not just at the bottom, that they go all the way through?
Brilliant. Thank you. Mr. Simone, I'm going to ask you to take the question from Gregory and perhaps the question from Ion, Image, and maybe a bit of Kemi's question as well. And perhaps you want to respond to Shadrach. Tom, Mr. Simone.
Okay. The PIB indeed did talk about making some allocations to communities. I think that in itself is not a silver bullet. The intent is very clear. The intent is to make sure that communities, the real oil-producing communities, can start to get some revenue flow from the oil to aid their development. And I would support that. But my caution is that the implementation of that needs to be carefully worked, because there will be issues around which community is all producing community, which community is not. But I don't think we should, because of the potential challenges, throw away that particular opportunity. So I think it will still be something which, if carefully worked, can actually start to make the communities to feel that they are actually a part owner and that they can directly control how their development is handled from that resource, because whatever percentage is given to the communities is going to be actually substantial. And if well managed, it will certainly start to yield difference in the way development is done in the communities. The second point is about what are we doing? How come nobody hears what you are doing? Don't you think you have an imaging problem? Maybe we have an image problem. But I think my view is we have tried in the past to play in the sector which we don't know how to handle. We are an oil and gas company, not a social development company. And therefore, trying to do that, in my opinion, we haven't been successful. But I think we have learned our lessons from the past, and we have moved away. In the past, we used to build roads, we used to build hospitals, we used to build schools. But we found out that these things are never sustained, they are never owned by the communities themselves. In some cases, the communities even see us as imposing projects on them. And that's why we have now moved away from that completely and helping communities to set up foundation. We put bulk money into the foundation account, help them to set up an administrative machinery that will put their own development in their hands. And we are beginning to see that this is really making a big difference where we have done this. And that is the model that we want to deploy across the entire Niger Delta. So we are communities, we have the freedom to decide what they want, and we will have money voted for them for that purpose.
Yeah, can I just pull it away perhaps a bit to Tom? Tom, do you think direct equity participation for all producing communities is a good idea? And also on the issue of the private sector and what Shadrach said about government participation in those things, is that the most efficient mode to develop infrastructure, for instance?
On the 10% idea was based on this 10% equity participation for the Delta was based on what they did in Alaska, as many people may know. But just briefly, the idea being that if you distribute oil revenues among the entire population, then you tax that, you start to recreate that kind of pact between rulers and ruled that you lose if you just have a pot of money from oil revenues going to the centre. It seems to work relatively well in Alaska. The problem with the Delta is that the amount would actually be so small by the time it got through that it might not have that effect, and the logistics are difficult. I also think the idea has basically died when, it seems to me, when Emmanuel Egboga was moved out of his job. I mean, it was his plan, and he was a former oil advisor to the president. I think it's a fascinating idea, and direct distribution is one of the strongest theories that anyone's come up with for dealing with the resource curse, but I think it's a very tricky one to handle. Quickly on Shedder's question, yeah, absolutely, there's a danger sometimes of confusing government and the private sector. And if there was a representative of the Nigerian government here, we would be putting the same questions for him. There is a responsibility on companies, especially ones with such relative power compared to the government of the country that they're operating in poorer countries. There is a responsibility to do no harm. So it is right that companies are called to account for their environmental impact, their impact on governance through corruption corruption of the style that we saw in, say, the Halliburton case, directly subverting public servants to the good of private groups. So I think there is an important case to be made. Yeah, to take your point that it's sometimes people ask too much of, or ask the wrong things of oil companies, but it's right that they're called to account on this principle of not doing any harm.
Thanks, Tom. Just advice to the Liberian National Oil Company, Mr. Simonery.
Well, I think, again, my advice would be that the sort of thing Nigeria wants to start to do now, that like the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I will really recommend that it is done in Liberia, whereby you actually have a portion of the revenue kept for posterity. The second point for me is ownership. Make sure that the host communities have some kind of ownership. That way, they will be the ones to even protect the facilities, because they can see the direct impact of that ownership, the direct revenue accruing from that particular facility, into their community. I think it's very, very important. The third point is that it's about jobs, it's about capacity building. I think in Nigeria, we left capacity building for communities till very, very late. In fact, it's only in the last 5 years that we started to do that. I think it must be an integral part of the takeoff of the oil industry. Make sure you build capacities for the local community so that they can actually be an integral part of your workforce. That, in my view, will help in a long way.
Tom, you had something to say.
Yeah, just a very quick point on that. I would agree with all of that. I'd say that there's also a reason there isn't a movement for the emancipation of Aberdeen, which is that when they struck gas, and obviously there's been lots of problems with the British energy industry, but one of the things they did well, and maybe others know more about this, is that they insisted on the maximum amount of training of local labour to a high level. Obviously, there's links down to lower levels are equally vital, but they absolutely insisted, much in the way China insists on technology transfer, on developing that human capital, which is an awful phrase, but you see what I mean? I think that's what Aberdeen, bizarrely, is a kind of quite a good case study of how to avoid some of these pitfalls.
I think we have time for another 3, maybe 4, if you keep it short. Can I take the gentleman in the tie there, please, in the middle? Yes.
Good evening. My name's Winston Belgam. I'm here on behalf of the Uptonville Foundation. We are based in Central Port Harcourt. We own the Uptonville Oil and Gas Institute. And actually, a gentleman mentioned remittance company. We own MT Express, which is one of the remittance companies, which is quite interesting to talk later. But I wanted to hear more from you, sir, about what you say about capacity building. We, for better and for worse, got dragged into the whole amnesty rehabilitation of the youths, and I think we had about 100 of them, and incredible group of gentlemen and women. Some were a complete pain in the backside, but the majority were actually Like a lot of our teachers found themselves learning more from them about life than the teachers had to teach them. But I wondered, we ask ourselves, what's going to happen to these guys? I mean, we've taught them. A lot of them couldn't read, numeracy was low, and it's now time to give them jobs. It's now time to give them, what you said about capacity building in Liberia. And I wondered, how committed is Shell and other organizations to that? I mean, what the foundation have had to do by way of solution is actually start buying into some of your marginal oil fields just so that they'll listen to us. But I can imagine that getting really expensive and unsustainable.
Thank you,
and I
Winston.
wondered if it'd be good to hear what your solutions are. Thank you.
Can I take the gentleman in the suit there, second row behind the...
I got around to the whole issue of capacity building, because I think that really is the bane of this whole problem. I don't think it's a matter of education. I don't think it's good governance. You can look around the world at lousy governments all over the place. And the issue of poverty is not, is not endemic to Nigeria alone. 700 million Chinese people, with all the noise they're making, is still living under 50 cents a day. 600 million Indians, with the satellites and the atomic bomb they've got, are still living under 40 cents a day. So really, let's put everything in context. And with the oil issue, spillage, everything, they were spilling in South America long before they started spilling in Nigeria. The issue, the way I see it, now we're two hats. I run a venture capital firm, and I'm also the chairman of the African Caribbean Chamber of Commerce, and we do a lot of traveling in Africa. The issue here is the issue of trickle down. And the way it trickles down is what you've just glimpsed over as if it didn't exist, and that's the issue of capacity building. Now, I know that Nigeria put in legislation 2-3 years ago to do with local content, and it's long overdue, because the problem with Africa is a problem of inward investment. The inward investment invariably comes by bulge bracket firms. Bulge bracket firms have no interest in capacity building voluntarily unless there's legislation to make them engage local firms in their supply chain. And I think until these, and it's not just in the oil sector in Nigeria alone, this goes up into the mining sectors, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, some countries are so notorious, that when they get these major investments in, they even bring their own water carriers and their own, laborers from their home nations to do, to do the jobs.
Can I ask you to move to the question quickly, please?
I just wanted him to expatiate how in the oil sector they've actually started to implement the local content legislation that came in very recently.
Another quick couple of questions, 30 seconds. The lady there in the glasses, blue shirt, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Africa Practice. You mentioned a bit earlier about the problems with oil bunkering, and yourself was interviewed in a few Nigerian newspapers recently about the topic. I wonder if you can expand a bit about what you see would be a viable solution to stopping the oil bunkering, which is also causing major environmental problems. Thank you.
One more question from this end. Can I take the gentleman there, please?
Thank you. My name is Kelechi Kugo, and I'm a partner for Lake Investment Partners, and at the same time, I'm a technical advisor to the Minister of Trade and Investment in Nigeria. My question is, what is Shell's commitment to critical infrastructural development? And I give you my core focus, i.e. refineries. What sort of value addition are you bringing back to the communities or to Nigeria as a whole, given that most of your business is purely exploration, to which you export your crude, but whereas there could be the opportunity to refine your products locally, create value addition opportunities, and at the same time create job opportunities for the local communities.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Mr. Simonio to please speed through the Winston, Mr. Adeajayi, and Kelechi questions, and perhaps you might want to take on the bunkering one as well, and maybe comment on the other two briefly, because I'd still like to throw in just one more question after that.
So which two do you want to
post-amnesty issue, local content capacity building.
I think what you describe about post-amnesty job opportunity is really a concern for all of us. But that is not going to discourage us from prosecuting our agenda with respect to capacity building. Because when I talk about capacity building, we are not focusing on these 2,100 ex-militants. We are actually thinking about how to prevent the rank and file of militants from growing by making sure those children who have left schools, you can train them in some vocational areas where they can either be gainfully employed or whether they can set up their own business for themselves. And we are doing it in two approaches like that. I mean, we set young women and men up in business. We are training some people and giving them contracts. Another example of how we are improving capacity building is that we have recently set up a 4.5 billion naira fund with banks, targeting only Niger Delta small-scale enterprises. So that if you have a job with Shell, you can access this fund without any other collateral. The only collateral you have is the fact that you have a job with Shell. This is something very recent because we realize that our Niger Delta contractors have funding challenges. So we are dealing with it in so many forms. The other important thing I want to talk about local capacity building is that we look at the marine business as the one which is almost very natural to the people of the Niger Delta. And as a result, we have actually earmarked 80% of our marine business to Niger Delta. But I have also seen that this is not penetrating as deep as it should be, again, because of some corruption happening among so-called contractors. And I just give you a simple example. There was a year, about 2-3 years ago, I said, I want to see indigenes of a particular community being employed in our transport department. And I was given a fantastic idea that we want to employ females as drivers from Oguno community. So I saw a brochure one day with all the female drivers in front. Then I look at the name. I said, this name is not an Oguno name. This is an Igbo name. I was really furious. I called the logistics man. I said, what did I tell you? I said, give this job to Oguno people. And then we found out that they gave the job to an Oguno indigene, but he sold the job to an Igbo person. So all of that will actually work against how fast some of these things can grow. But I think it's just for me to mention that we are not allowing that to discourage it.
I was going to pass on quickly to I was going to pass on quickly to Tom. Please, on the oil bunkering issue, your thoughts quickly.
Quickly on oil bunkering. Potential ways to break that. I think it's very hard to break down when the data is still so bad. Well, no one really ever knows how much Nigeria produces in a day, so it's quite hard to tell how much is going missing. If you look at the market, the European and South American markets, anecdotally for this stuff, I mean, that's obviously a place to target. And this idea of fingerprinting crude, which you would have to do, you could only do if the Nigerian Navy was less of a part of the problem and could be part of the solution. Just on bunkering, I mean, you know, Utu described the lawlessness of the Delta. I mean, in a lawless region, bunkering and illegal refining, I mean, that is local content, isn't it? That's people. There's people carving out a bit of their own, a bit of the industry, a bit of what's beneath their soil. And just very quickly on the trickle down question of capacity building, I would agree that it's obviously very important. But the oil industry, the extractive industry in all but a very small, even somewhere like Botswana, where it's been well managed and there's a very small population, the extractive industries are never going to provide mass employment. That's not what they do. That's what agriculture does, what manufacturing does. So it's about trying to limit the damage of the extractive industry on the rest of the economy, which is where the real jobs are created.
Okay, I'm just going to bring in Stephen Phelps, and I noticed Patrick Smith is here. I was wondering whether I could give you the last say, just make one or two comments. But Stephen Phelps, you had like he says, I'm Stephen Phelps. I'm running a very small risk consultancy.
Thank you. And as you know, sir, I spent 3.5 years working for you, identifying threats and risks to your business. I'd just like to make a point to Tom before I ask my question, though. You say there's no movement for the emancipation of Aberdeen. Isn't that the Scottish National Party? You do have a wry sense of humour. You deserve that. So yeah, the question. While I worked for you, the company had a very passive posture with regards to getting its message across. It accepted an awful lot of criticism in a mute fashion, and I constantly agitated for a much more focused corporate messaging strategy, which I see you're now publishing photographs and copies of the joint investigation reports about damage to pipelines. Has that actually reaped any rewards in terms of your corporate reputational status?
Okay. Patrick, did you have any comments or anything to say before we come back?
I would just like to go back to this issue of the European Union, which has been pushing for the kind of European equivalent of the American Dodd-Frank legislation, which is, as far as I understand it, demands very strict conditions from the oil companies, the reporting of the monies going back between the oil companies and the government and the derivation of those monies and so on, how it relates to extractive sector. Thanks very much. Across the world, but particularly in places like Congo, Kinshasa, and Nigeria, and so on. And my understanding is that the Europeans also want to make this a point of law. They don't just want it to be something like the EITI approach, which is a purely voluntaristic approach. And I think last year this argument was held in Paris, and my understanding was that all the oil companies actually opposed it very strongly, and they said, we will not join an arrangement in which we have a legal obligation, as you do in America now under the Dodd-Frank legislation, to make public our contributions to government and so on, our payments to government. And at the root of that seems to be this issue of how much tax do oil companies pay, country by country, as opposed to their global sum. So what we know about Shell, for example, is we know the Royal Dutch Shell people headquartered in The Hague pay X amount of tax. What we don't know is how your tax is calculated country by country in Nigeria. So you say, for example, you pay $2 a barrel to, sorry, you only get $2 a barrel, the rest goes to government. But what we don't know is your operating costs and the international competitive standard for those operating costs. Why, for example, are your operating costs that much higher in Nigeria than, say, Indonesia or Qatar? And I'm just, when you said that you're very interested in pushing transparency, could you explain why the oil companies are opposing making the Dodd-Frank type laws apply in Europe? And what would you say to the proposition that all the oil companies, not just Shell, obviously all of them, announce country by country how much tax they pay and the basis for their cost structures? Thank you, Patrick. So, Mr. Simonon, last word to you in response to those two.
Let me, first of all, answer the easier question. Indeed, you are right. You will notice that we have gotten a bit more aggressive than we used to in the past. Now we publish what we do. We go out with very strong refutal when we see allegations that are wrong being made against us, etc., etc. And it is paying off little by little, but we're not there yet. And if I look at the Shell reputation tracker last year, there was a significant upswing in our reputation in Nigeria among the special public. And I take that to mean that they are becoming a lot more aware of our issues. We are also becoming a lot more transparent about our operations, and that is really giving us that improvement in reputation. But we are still not there yet. But on the whole issue of transparency about tax, I think what the EU will be doing when it comes to law, then it will be a lot easier for the oil companies to go to their host government to say, we are part of EU and we are mandated by law to do this. To do anything which looks like a voluntary declaration, I don't think any government will really take kindly to that. It's not because we want to hide anything, it's because we believe that we are not there to embarrass our host government. we are there to try and encourage them to actually toe the path of transparency, but we are not going to do anything that will embarrass them. So we are all waiting for this EU legislation, which we can then use as a basis for going to government and advocate that we think it is good business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simone. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there, but I'd like you all to encourage you to continue the conversation outside. And thank you for not being so hard on Shell. And also to our honorary Nigerian, Tom Burgess. Can we just give them a round of applause? Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. I'll ask you please to sit down, to remain seated for one last part of the program. But before we go into that, I just wanted to make a reference to the intervention by Peter Sharper. I know Peter Sharper very well, and I know that generally speaking for our event, we want to be very, very conscious to generate debate, to provoke discussion. And to do so, we have to respect the opinion of others, even if we do not agree with them. People have to be able to speak freely in this context, and to challenge ourselves, to challenge our assumptions. Whether we agree with what is said or not, we have to respect the opinion of people that speak. Now, after saying that, I said earlier that I will say more about what this public lecture series is about. And to do that, I'll ask Don Amokwe to come up. Don Amokwe is a press photographer and editor of African Screens. He took some photographs about which he will now provide some background.
Thank you very much. I work as a part-time press photographer, and I get privileged to cover some very profound moments, like the Tottenham riot. I live in Tottenham, but it's profound for me, like the inauguration of Barack Obama, World Cup in South Africa. But when people ask me that, what's the most profound moment for you as a photographer, I go back to my experience back in Africa when I traveled a couple of years back to do a photo essay. Basically, I wanted to take pictures just for my own private collection. And it was around 6:30, 6:45 on a Saturday morning. I saw a couple of women, with a machete going into the forest. So instinct, I picked up my camera, I haven't really had a bath or anything. I just went after them, just wanted to see what was going on. And as I was following them through the forest, I started hearing a couple of kids, started hearing water and kids playing. So I diverted off them and started following my ears through the forest. And then I saw a couple of kids, if I could change this picture, a couple of kids playing, playing in the river. And I laid on my stomach, and I started taking pictures. I was taking pictures of these kids. I didn't want them to know I was around because they'll start posting, as people would naturally do. And then suddenly I had this feeling someone was staring at me. So I looked to my side and I saw this young girl. I didn't really know where she came from, and I was scared because, being African in the forest on your own, sure, being African in the forest, you know very well that no one can sneak up to you in the forest because of the dead leaves, you would hear people coming. But, there was this girl, let me see if I can get a picture of her. There's this girl, just same expression, just there next to me in the forest. And, immediately I stood up with the camera and I was like, whoa, where did you come from? And the instinct came back. I snapped a couple of pictures of her. And I looked at her again and I saw the expression on her face. There was just something, something not right, The expression stayed like that. And suddenly the kids in the river ran up the embankment when they saw me with the camera. And one of the kids came to hold on to her. But she wasn't in the moment, She wasn't prepared to pose or do anything. There was something on this young girl's mind And nothing was going to take that moment away from her. She was upset, and she wanted to express that mode of being upset. The young girl's mom came and saw her, and as you know, we like to do back home, you know, smacked her over the head, you know, what's wrong with you? You know, like, change your expression. And the girl literally went down and came back up and stayed in the same, gave the same expression, just like that. And that's the story behind this image. It's the story of a young girl, probably age of 3, probably 5 now. Only God knows what her life is like, what she lives, you know, what her future is. But there was something that made a girl so young refuse to lose the feeling she had at that point in time. She was upset. There was something in her mind, something had happened, and this is what she wanted to express. And far too often people ask me, what is photography to you? And photography to me is capturing a profound moment like this in a single picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. Can we keep the picture there, please? Just for the one just with her. Thank you. When I saw the picture, I was held in its thrall, as I'm sure, as you obviously were, and it crystallized with me. I called Femi immediately because Femi is a photography aficionado guru and I called him immediately and I said, Femi, look at this photograph. And we were both just completely taken by it. And it's really struck us, both of us, that this is what this public lecture series is about. It's to ask questions about what kind of future is she going to have in Africa? What kind of school is she going to attend? Is it going to be a structure that's worthy of deserving of creating a human mind in? A structure that's deserving of the greatness, of the potential of a human mind? Or is it going to be a structure that's going to be a hovel, a shack, that's not even fit to raise goats in? What kind of rights is she going to have as a human being, as a woman? What kind of rights is she going to have in her marital home? Will she have a choice over who she marries? Who are the people that would make the decisions? Who are the government ministers, the presidents that will make the decisions that affect her lives? Will she continue to live in a continent where only 1 of 54 presidents is a woman, and that woman the first ever in African history? What kind of job will she have? What kind of future will she have? Those are the questions that we seek to answer in this public lecture series. And we're not alone. There are many people like that that concern themselves with these questions. The 3 people on this panel also do in their own ways. Patrick Smith is in the front row here. I've worked with him. And these are the things that really, really, really concern him. I've had a lot of conversations with him about these issues. And that's why we're all gathered here. We're gathered here to unearth the issues and to find resolutions and solutions to them. And I welcome you on board, and I hope that you'll continue to support us as we move along. Thank you very, very much.